Well, hello everybody. It's Dan here again, managing partner of Infotex, and this is our fourth You Spoke, We Listened of the year. Kind of turns out we're doing them quarterly. And so, first of all, we've got people asking us to keep up the live webinars. We did a few live webinars in the spring, and then kind of started doing some reruns, doing some movies and stuff, and we had people say, hey, what happened to the live webinars? And so we just did one on our technology planning webinar in October. It went really well. Meanwhile, the October webinar was about technology planning, and one of the things we always release in the technology planning webinar is a tactical plan alternative spreadsheet, which is a compilation of all the takeaways we've noted at bank or credit union security conferences. And then we make that available as part of our technology planning to help people kind of, brainstorm what, kind of get a feel for what kind of new things are going to be coming down the road. And this year's, by the way, is very compliance oriented because the discussions that we were able to go to was a panel discussion of examiners. And so we will publish that. I'm actually going to write a short article, and so that's what the holdup is. But the person who's in charge of bugging me about that, Sarah, she brings the fun into the organization, and part of that is making sure I get that article written. And she's assured me that I'm going to be done writing it by the end of next week. Meanwhile, we have had a lot of people say, hey, we love the vendor management movies that you have on the website, but they're really meant more for, the drill down. They're really meant for people that are really trying to get into the weeds of vendor management. And so we have a 2-hour contract review webinar out there. Now, if you want to know about how to review a contract, watch that. More importantly, we're reviewing the Infotex contract in that webinar. So if you're already having to review our contract, just so you know, watch that webinar and you'll see what is missing in our contract. And then, of course, you're going to have to risk rank that and get back to us, right? But what we decided to do was to really kind of rearrange all of our vendor management presentations. We do need one on the basics and just kind of a high-level introduction to vendor management. But then we're going to break up the assurance review, the insurance review, the contract review. We'll break that 2-hour movie. Well, for one, we're going to redo it, try to make it shorter, but we're going to make it, more reasonable to watch. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a playlist, and we're really kind of getting into these playlists on YouTube where you can watch a playlist and it'll give you everything you need to know about a particular subject, in this case vendor management. And so our goal is to try to have that available by April of 2021. And so if you're just really tired of vendor management and you want to delegate it to somebody, in April of 2021, they'll be able to watch a series of about 5 movies. And by the way, the 5th movie is business continuity planning, how to review a vendor's business continuity plan. And then it'll actually be a summary of the playlist. Finally, this last one, I'm starting to feel like I'm being picked on here, but there's a 2-part to it. In our last You Spoke, We Listened, somebody had asked, can Dan learn to play something besides the harmonica? I guess we're getting tired of Dan playing the harmonica, right? And my You Spoke, We Listened. And so the last time I played the flute in July, I thought that was, pretty good. I learned how to play a little Aboriginal flute. And so the next You Spoke, We Listened, can Dan learn how to play that flute better? And so I hope that this is better.
Our lawyers want you to know that when you attend any of our webinars or watch any of our movies, you're agreeing to the terms of service located at the link on the screen. We're also required to provide this abbreviation of what our terms of service include. The main point we need to get across is that regulations change on a regular basis, and we want you to know that what we present can sometimes be very time-dated information or our own interpretation of new guidance or regulations. The materials we present today are subject to change. Also, whenever we provide free boilerplates as part of our webinars or movies, we're required to point out our transfer of copyright agreement, which is also located on our website in our IT resources library. You can read it by going to the link on the screen. Please also note, by attending an Infotex webinar or by receiving any Infotex movie, you may be added to our mailing list. We apologize if you'd rather not receive notice of other free education. You can always opt out at the link on the screen. And now, it is our pleasure to introduce to you our webinar moderator, the code curator and special envoy from the seam, Michael Hartke.
Hello everybody, my name is Michael Hartke. I'm the curator of code here at Infotex and your moderator. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them as you see pictured here. We will make sure they get answered. We'd like to point out destinations on our website, webinars.infotex.com, where you can find our upcoming webinar topics and event schedule, and then also movies.infotex.com, where you can find the movies of these webinars and training videos. And now, I'd like to introduce the speaker of today's event, the awareness guru from Indiana, the breaker of tech and enforcer of policy. He has 13 letters after his name, and they all spell risk management. Dan Hadaway. Dan?
Thanks a lot, Mike. Yet again, another really good introduction. Welcome, everybody. I understand that a lot of you are actually maybe first-time Dan Hadaway movie viewers or have been to a Infotex webinar for the first time. And so I want to welcome you. Part of our tradition here is that we do a shout-out at the beginning of all of our movies and webinars. And so today's shout out goes to all the information security officers for smaller community-based banks around Indiana and Ohio who are really dealing with the cat that's out of the bag. And I'll be explaining that in a little bit. But they are really appreciative that you've decided to take some time to watch this movie, because we're going to be talking about ways that we can improve upon the productivity of our bank. And I want you to know right off the bat that I'm not going to be using a lot of acronyms or no references to Star Trek. And I'm not even going to go over data flow diagrams, other than I will talk about the two bubbles at the top of this diagram. But yes, Infotex actually diagrammed out, what we call our formal communication system, and I'll be explaining a little bit about that, in a few minutes as well. But today, I want to talk about why we can leverage the recovery, with everything that we have going on with this pandemic, and there's a lot, right? But one of the things that's happening is we're all starting to learn how to work in what we call a distributed office environment. And in that, and along with that, comes a whole new set of practices surrounding how we go about getting our jobs done. And so what I want to talk about is just a small subset of that called the meeting platform. So for you, it might be Zoom or WebEx or GoToMeeting is what Infotex uses. And then we want to, talk about how we need to adjust the traditional meeting management best practices that we've all learned in our career. And how can we reinvent the way we meet so that we can meet safely and more productively? And what I realized after I designed this agenda is that we can actually change it a little bit into a question. Why learn traditional practices and reinvent them safely? And so the theme, or hopefully what I'm going to give you to take away, is one main control. I call it MFA. That's an acronym, so I'll spell it out, multi-factor authentication. That's the one takeaway that I hope you all walk out of here with. But then the second takeaway I hope you all walk out of here with is why learn traditional practices and reinvent them safely. And so let's go ahead and get started. So when I first started doing webinars like this, I looked like the guy on the right there, right? All dressed up in a suit and tie. But it didn't take long for me to start looking like this, because I realized you don't even really know what I look like in these webinars. Now, this was before the pandemic, before we had to start turning on our webcams, okay? But I look like this now during the pandemic because it's just really hard for me to, all right, I'll be honest with you, because my haircut stinks, all right? And I look terrible in a suit when I've got a haircut like this, all right? I'll be honest with you. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So now, if your IT person has convinced you to come to this movie, like I said, we're really, really happy that you did. And you're probably wondering, what does an IT guy like Dan Hadaway know about meeting management? Well, our company went remote in the year 2002, so I'm really here to share with you what we've been learning over the last 18 years and the way we were able to manage the productivity of our team while being a distributed office was through what we called a formal communication system that really leveraged meeting management practices that I learned from this guy, Brian Tracy. And the 1980s Dan Hadaway, the guy that wore a suit and tie every day, was running a company where we had this huge meeting that was, it brought in a lot of people from the company. It was a very expensive meeting, and we wanted to get the most out of the meeting. And so I had already been listening to self-improvement tapes by Brian Tracy, saw that he was giving a class on meeting management, and boy, am I glad I took that class. Now, getting ready for this webinar, I, of course, Googled meeting management best practices, and I'm kind of looking, and there's a few practices that I'm not practicing. And I think maybe the reason why is because when we tried them in the 80s, nothing was new, but when we tried them, they didn't work. And so, the practices I'm going over are just the ones that worked for me and me only in my unique situation, running that 200-person company and now running a distributed office that's an information security consultancy. But please know that during the recovery, whether you're already opening now or whether you're still waiting for the state to let you open or whatever, the risk is going to be when we get together. And if you think about it, if you look and read the guidelines that your states put out, what they're really saying is that if you're going to meet in a conference room, you all need to wear masks. You should wipe the room down before and after you meet, and you should use hand sanitizer after you pass papers to one another or whatever. It's just during the recovery, we're going to continue to use what I call the meeting platforms, Zoom, GoToMeeting, WebEx, whatever you're using in your bank. We're going to keep using that, because we're not going to want to have to spend an hour getting ready and cleaning up after a meeting that only takes 30 minutes, right? And so, and I get it, it's probably not going to take an hour, but you get my point. That's a waste of time. Whereas if we already have the meeting management platform, I'm here to tell you that two people in offices adjacent to each other are probably rather going to, get into a meeting management platform and meet there than to have to go into each other's office and put on their mask and do all the kind of stuff that you want to do to keep yourself safe and that sort of thing. And so during the recovery, we're going to continue to use our meeting management platform. And what I want you to know is that I think once we enter into this new normal, or whatever we're calling it nowadays, once we get back from the pandemic, after the vaccine's been distributed to everybody, and we've completely exterminated the COVID virus and everything like that, I'm here to tell you that we're still going to use Zoom or GoToMeeting or WebEx or Microsoft Teams or whatever it is that you're using as your meeting platform. And the reason why is because we've already learned it's much more productive. It's much more productive. And so what I'm proposing is that we reinvent our protocols that we use in meetings. Why don't we start, though, by learning those traditional practices? Let's just go through a refresher course. Let's just go through a reminder of those traditional practices. So the best practices that Brian Tracy was, big on, or maybe the way I ought to put it is the best practices that I'm still using today, because when I've been Googling around, trying to make sure that I have my arms around all meeting management best practices, I remember a few that we never really adopted at that company, and I think the reason why is because of the fact that they didn't work. And I'm not saying it wouldn't work for any organization, they just simply didn't work in my career. But what did work was always being aware of the cost of meetings. And what I mean by that is that we can really spend a lot of money in terms of time, and time is money, not to mention that, you get, you get your C-suite together in one meeting and you're spending a lot of money on that meeting, right? And so if we can just be aware of that, that'll motivate us to keep our meetings productive. Now, I do run into IT people on a regular basis who have kind of taken that to the extreme and they don't want to be in any meetings, all right? And they're missing the point. It's the unproductive meetings we need to avoid, not meetings in general, especially if we're going to be working remotely. But then one of the ways we can manage the cost of the meeting is by making sure that we're always aware of the purpose of the meeting, which, if the meeting doesn't create value, then it's not serving any purpose. Let's stop having the meeting, or at least let's cancel this week or this month's meeting or whatever the cycle is for recurring meetings. We use recurring meetings a lot in our company because it makes it a lot easier for us to cut down on the amount of time that the back and forth that it would normally take to set up a meeting about an individual topic takes. So it increases productivity there. But we also learned, and we started this way back in the 80s, and we kind of pulled it forward into the 2020s now. But if we identify the type by each agenda item, it really helps us stay on agenda. And what I mean by that is it just happened about a week ago where we started solving a problem in the meeting where there was only two of us that were solving the problem. And fortunately, someone said, hey, isn't this supposed to be a status check? Why are we solving the problem now? And that allowed us to pull back into the meeting and continue to make everybody's time productive. And obviously, you got to have an agenda, by the way. That was kind of one of the major basics that, if you're not already using agendas for your meetings, that's critical. But beyond that, those agendas should establish what we need to know in order to be prepared for the meeting, and they should start on time and they should finish on time. And at first, back in the old days in the 80s, we took to putting time frames on each part of the agenda. But what we learned in the remote environment is as long as you honor the finishing time, we decided not to put times on each part of the agenda. And I'll probably explain a little bit more when we get to the next section on that. But sticking to the agenda is the hardest part, and it requires somebody to be identified as the meeting moderator, as the person who's not rude if they interrupt people saying, hey, let's table that. And so I used alliteration to learn things back in the 80s, and so I'm not sure if this is Brian Tracy's words or if this is just the way I walked away, the way I took notes from that meeting, but I've been using these terms ever since, which is the meeting moderator should destroy distractions, table tangents, and enlist listening. And yes, that means that the meeting moderator needs to say, hey, you two, we're in a meeting here. It's costing us a lot of money. Let's pay attention, or let's listen, right? And so, we need to make sure that that person that has all those great stories tells the stories before or after the meeting and not during the meeting. And then one of the most important things we can do to establish productivity from the meeting is an action item summary at the end of the meeting, but also at the beginning of the next meeting. And we really kind of refer to them as minutes, right? But when we review the minutes at the beginning of a meeting that goes over the promises that were made the last time we met, those promises are more often kept, or at least we're coming in with status as to why we didn't meet the promises, which really kind of takes me to a very profound mantra that a colleague of mine used to use back in the 80s when we were really focused in on managing that big meeting, is that he would keep reminding us, and he was the meeting moderator, by the way, that a decision without a deadline is not a decision, it's just a wish. And if we can take that motto into our meetings, we will get a lot more out of our meetings. Now, the little gear thing I just put up there at the top, I don't know if you saw that, but that's my reminder to also establish what was also really important that we learned, which was we had people coming from, all different directions of our company into this huge meeting, right? And then now in the remote environment, we have people that hardly ever get to see each other. And so at the end of every meeting, we always open it up for an around the room. Is there anything else we need to talk about while we're all here? Does that make sense? And that around the room, by the way, might drive new action items that need to be added to the decision summary. And so don't forget that part of it. And then back in the 80s, we ended up assigning a secretary because the moderator was so darn busy moderating the meeting that someone else had to keep the minutes. And back in those days, of course, we were writing the minutes by hand, right? And so it wasn't as easy as it might be nowadays. And when I talk about the minutes, when we get into the reinvention, you'll see how that's going to be a much easier task to accomplish because of the way you can manage a remote meeting using the meeting management software. And then review the action item summary or the decision summary or the minutes, whatever you wanted to call them, which was a very, very important part of the meeting. It was one of the most important practices. It's what guaranteed that the meeting actually accomplished something, because in the words of a coworker, and I don't know if this is his own original saying, or if it's something that he learned when he was listening to a Brian Tracy or a Zig Ziglar or some kind of a self-help tape that we all listened to back in the 80s. But this guy, his name was Ed Moyer, is a great man, and he used to always say, a decision without a deadline is not a decision, it's just a wish. And boy, when we started taking that approach in our meetings, did we start seeing meetings become more productive, because what meetings ended up being was the place that you made promises. And then those promises were documented in the minutes of the meeting, and then we would review the minutes of the meeting in the next meeting. And that was the motivator to either not make the promise in the first place, or to make sure that the promise was realistic in the second place, and then definitely to follow through on the promise and to show up to that next meeting with the status, I did what I said I was going to. We would often assign a secretary to the meetings. Now that one big long meeting management, the manager meeting, I should say, with the 20 to 30 people that would show up, that big expensive one at the 200 employee company, we definitely had a secretary for that meeting, because it was different officers of the company coming in to meet with the managers, and so we had to have one person running the whole meeting. Nowadays here at Infotex, we don't assign a secretary, and I'll be talking about that when we get to the reinvention, but suffice it to say, the meeting moderator actually acts as the secretary of the meeting in the virtual environment, and we still need a second person, or the people in the meeting need to act as the person who is usually the guy that checks the thermometer, that opens and shuts the door, that helps people get into the meeting, let people know when they're up next and that sort of thing, the doorkeeper of the meeting, so to speak. And then also know up here where we got this around the room kind of gear thing here, that's really kind of intentionally gears, because it's kind of what makes the whole thing work. But if we're going to get everybody together anyway, before we end the meeting, we should get everybody an opportunity to bring up what pertains to everybody in that particular meeting. And so we would always have an around the room at the end of the meeting. And just so you know, sometimes the around the room would spawn another review of the minutes, because there would be new action items to add into the minutes. And those were the traditional practices that we all followed really the first 2-3 years really at Infotex, because we didn't just drop what we were doing and went remote, we kind of migrated to remote. But now I want to talk to you about how we reinvented those practices and how you can become really productive. So, we've got traditional practices, we need to reinvent them because the pandemic has kind of created a whole brand new paradigm for us, right? We're all working from home. We have remote access. The cat's out of the bag. When we come back, the management team's not going to want to have that remote access removed. You know, we took a survey in Ohio, by the way, and found that over 50% of the banks at this conference that we were at were planning on having more than 20% of their people stay remote even after the pandemic was over. And that was back in April when we didn't think the pandemic was going to last as long as it did. Now that we're having the web conferencing practices and stuff burned into our mind, you know what I mean? I just feel like that cat will never go back in the bag. But we also, at Infotex, and I'm seeing some of our bank clients realize the value of a good, strong, secure messaging system. And what I'm talking about is a chat room that's kind of a chat room on steroids, and it's secure, and it's usually in the cloud, and it's by a vetted vendor. Your information security officer has reviewed a SOC 2 or an audit report, make sure that the messaging platform is secure. And we use Slack at Infotex. I find a lot of banks are using Microsoft Teams, which combines a web conferencing platform with a secure messaging platform and many other collaborative tools, or collaboration tools, I should say. But I'm not going to go into all details of how to use Zoom or how to use WebEx or how to use Microsoft Teams. I'm very familiar with GoToMeeting because that's the platform we chose way back in 2011. And really we had to wait for 2011 because they didn't have back then was a SAS 70. They didn't have a SAS 70 yet, or what we now call a SOC 2, the audit report. I just remembered I was supposed to not use acronyms. And so a SOC 2 is an audit report that a vendor will give a bank that proves that they're supposedly secure. And so we're familiar with GoToMeeting, but what I really would like to do is, rather than tell you all the things that your meeting management platform may or may not do, what I want you to know before we go too much further is that if you look here, if you look carefully, most of the features are pretty much the same. The pricing's pretty much the same. I call this ratcheting, where, you know, there's 4 main players that I'm representing here. There's more than 4. But they're in competition with each other. They're watching what each other's doing. They're in kind of a revolutionary state of development because for the first time in their history, everybody in the whole world wants to buy their services. And they're not doing that bad, by the way, of responding to that increase, that very extremely rapid growth. And suffice it to say, all 4 of these are legitimate. If your bank is using any one of these 4, you'll be in good shape, and you'll have the same features as the other 3 within a year or 2, because each of them are going to learn what the other one's doing, and they're going to apply, you know, the good ideas that their competition's using to their own system. And so I would like to just do a comparison. And again, I promised you I wouldn't show you data flow diagrams, but I did say I was going to show you the top 2 bubbles there. And then so, you know, I want to just talk about the difference between the traditional practices and then what we did at Infotex in order to make sure that we were properly managing our distributed office. And what we actually did is we set up what we call a formal communication system. And that formal communication system not only allowed us to manage the productivity of working from home, but it actually made the cost of meetings substantially less than what they normally would be. And I'll explain one reason why here soon. But when it came to the purpose of the meeting, I mean, creating value is always the purpose of the meeting, and that still means that we get together and we say, hey, you know what, I don't have anything to talk about, no one else does, let's just cancel this meeting. Now the difference is, in the traditional meeting management protocols, you just say, hey, we got anything to talk about, let's cancel the meeting. In the virtual meeting protocols, you still have to meet just to know that you don't need to meet, because you can't just, you know, stick your head in somebody's door and say, hey, do we still need to meet today or whatever, right? So you still have to get together in order to meet. And so because of that, the agenda just becomes that much more important, and then the agenda types are more important as well. And I want you to know there's 2 new types that have kind of evolved over the last 18 years at Infotex, starting with what we call war coding. And this is actually a term that arose out of our programming team. And the reason why is way back in 2011 when we first got GoToMeeting, in those days we only needed 1 account. And so we would all share the same GoToMeeting account, and sometimes it kind of, you had to, and the reason we would use GoToMeeting, not only for our own meetings, but we would also use them for webinars and that sort of thing, right? And so what would happen, or what I noticed in about, 2012 or so, is I started noticing the logs that, my goodness, the programming squad is getting together a lot of times after normal business hours for 8-hour-long meetings. What the heck's going on with this? And what I found out is that they would actually work together. They would say, we're working separately together. And I'd be like, you're what? And they'd say, we're war coding, which means we're working separately together. And so if you think about it, if there's programmer A, programmer B, and programmer C, programmer A is working on some sort, some part of the source code of our SIEM is what we call it, the software we make available as part of our security business, right? And so programmer A would be working along, and then if he needs some information that programmer C had, and they weren't together, he would be in a situation where he'd have to wait sometimes a whole day before he can continue with that particular part of his job. Whereas if they were all working separately together, he would just be able to say, hey, programmer C, do you have this information? Programmer C would Slack it to him using that secure chat room I'm talking about, and then they'd be able to move on. And so they became much, much more productive because they were war coding. Meanwhile, this second agenda type here, connecting, is because we're all working from home. And so one of the things that we add into our standard agenda template is connections. And so at the end of the meeting, after the around the room, or actually we usually kind of encourage that it happens. Any connections, we say, during the around the room section of our meeting, which is always last, we will make sure that people arrange getting together with each other. Because again, it's not like you can just walk down the hall and say, hey, when do you want to meet about such and such? So in that meeting, at the end of the meeting, we would have an agenda type called connections. But I will say one thing, if agendas were not critical in the traditional meeting protocols, they certainly are in the virtual meeting protocols. And really, we've kind of gone to recurring meetings and recurring agendas. So standard agendas is what we call them. The same outline for every meeting of this type. And we have several recurring meetings. If you download the formal communication system boilerplate that we've made available, you'll see what we mean. And by the way, if you can't download it because you're not at the webinar, just send an email to info@infotex.com and we'll get you that boilerplate. But you might want to check with your information security officer because they might already have. Well, you can get it anyway, and then they might say, well, we already have that. We already looked into that. We already considered that. Starting the meeting on time is really even more important now, right? Because we're not going to be able to, run around the bank and look for people and that sort of thing. So we need to start the meetings on time. That's like even more critical than ever before. But expecting people to be prepared and watching the clock. Watching the clock's easier because you can have the clock right on the screen that everybody's looking at. Okay, so that's the easy part. But sticking to the agenda, making sure that everybody's prepared for the meeting, that sort of thing, not so easy. And really, when it comes to sticking to the agenda, the person that runs the meeting, the moderator, is going to be walking us through the agenda. That person's going to be busy because one of the things we're going to be doing, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail later, is we're going to be documenting the minutes as we go through the meeting right there in the agenda. And the reason why is because everybody's looking at it anyway. At Infotex, people a lot of times are typing up in Slack what they want the minutes to be, so that when it's time to document the minutes, they just Slack that to the moderator. The moderator copies and pastes it into the Word file that is to the agenda, and everybody's like, yep, that's the decision we just made. In the traditional meeting protocols, there was usually that person that sat in what Brian Tracy called the second power seat, who would be the one that would let people in and out, let them know when they're coming up, let people outside waiting to come into the meeting know that, hey, we're about ready for you, or we're running 10 minutes behind. That person will usually check the thermometer, make sure everybody's okay, open up the windows or close the blinds, that sort of thing, right? Well, in the virtual world, we need a second person to not really worry about the thermostat. We're all doing that because we're at home, right? We need the second power seat person to be looking for latency issues, to be letting us know people who had dropped off, to let us know who's in what we call not listening mode that I'll get to in a minute here. But to really kind of help the moderator know what's going on, because the moderator ain't sitting in the power seat watching everybody at the conference room table. The moderator's staring and walking through a Word document. And so a second person, or really at Infotext, it's kind of the whole team that does it, is monitoring the attendee list. And I'll show you a little bit what I mean by that in a few minutes here. But tabling the tangents, still just as important as before. I think it might be even more important, I'm not sure, but if you imagine everybody's getting together and we're not seeing each other over the break room, over lunch, we're not going to lunch, so we're going to go off on tangents a lot more when we're working remotely maybe than we would if we were working at the bank, because we don't have the coffee break together. Makes sense? And so, believe it or not, we finally tossed in the towel on that. And really, started addressing latency issues and that sort of thing and drop-offs, and then monitoring who would declare not listening mode. And you're probably still, is Dan ever going to explain that to us, okay? And so let me put it this way. There was a time when we all just assumed everybody was listening. Then we'd get to the decision summary and it'd be like, well, remember us, we just talked about this, right? And so not everybody's listening. It became a problem. We'd start hearing people typing. Have you noticed that yet? Someone in this meeting's not listening because I can hear you typing, and you're not typing the notes. The moderator's the one that's typing the notes. Makes sense? And so at Infotext, what we realized is that we're at home. We're sitting down to our computers where important emails are coming in from clients, and guess what? Destroying distractions is a heck of a lot harder. And so what we switched to about, 2 years ago, is instead of just, like pretending that everybody's listening, we created a not listening mode.
Hey Dan, I'm going into not listening mode.
Oh, all right, thanks Brian. You see, going into not listening mode, that simple. We start off saying, you just need to say, I'm in not listening mode when you get distracted, and then when you return, say, I'm back.
I'm back.
Okay, Brian, welcome back. And there you go, Brian just came back. You see how he said he came back? Welcome back, Brian. But we're moving on, right? Well, it turned out that we're just saying not listening and back, and that's fine. But you get the point. Now the people in the meeting know, hey, George just left us. Something must have came up. He's not listening, so we better circle back around and let George know what just happened when he comes back. And it's usually that second power seat that says, hey, George is back. George, we just did this. Okay, well, actually, that would be if George dropped off. Let me back up. If George lost his internet connection, that second person would say, hey, I think we lost George. And then when George came back, that second person, the second power seat, the second moderator would say, George is back. Well, in large meetings, you need to have somebody assigned to that task. In most of our meetings, the whole team kind of covers that, but it needs to be covered. Now, back to the not listening mode. If George took a call from a very important client that we would all agree is more important than the meeting, any meeting we're in, because the client comes first at Infotext, he would say, not listening, got a call. He'd take the call. Well, the second power seat, the second moderator would say, hey, George needs to be in on this part. We better hold off on this until George comes back. Because the moderator, him or herself, might not remember that George and Susie are both in not listening mode. And then at the end, of course, we'd have an action item summary and then the around the room. The around the room, I feel, is even more important in the virtual environment because, again, we're not in the same office anymore. And so we might need to do connections. We might need to bring up our own agenda that didn't make it into the agenda because we didn't think about it in time or whatever. Because keep in mind, we want our agendas to be published in advance. We want our minutes to be published right there in the meeting. And then what you also need to understand is that the power seats are different, right? And so this is a typical traditional meeting room, right? And so what Brian Tracy taught in the 80s is that the moderator of the meeting should sit in that end seat on the left there. That was the power seat. And that only is if the door was on the right. So if the door is on this wall here, then this right here is what Brian Tracy would call the power seat. This is where the moderator should sit. The moderator sees what everybody in the meeting's doing. The moderator sees who's coming in, who's leaving, et cetera, et cetera. The guy that adjusts the thermostat, or the woman that adjusts the thermostat, usually would sit here, right? Right? That's the second power seat. You want to know where the new power seat is? It's in the meeting platform. It's the controls. It's setting up the meeting. It's knowing how to dismiss people and knowing how to elevate people, knowing how to give people keyboard and mouse control, knowing how to give people, presentation rights, knowing how to share your screen. There's a lot of things that if you learn them, you're now in a power seat. Or at least in that second power seat to help the moderator out in the first power seat. And I maintain the second power seat actually is more powerful now than the first power seat.
Meanwhile, even if you don't buy into the power seat thing, know that what we found over the years is that even if you're not in a Zoom meeting, if you're just on a phone call with more than 3 or 4 people, to identify who's currently controlling the meeting. And so, you could, be the person that set up the meeting. You could be the organizer of the meeting according to Zoom or GoToMeeting or, whoever, right? But someone else could be presenting. And so it's very helpful to establish who is in control of the meeting. It's usually whoever's screen is being shared, but not always. And again, this is something we found before we actually started using meeting platforms where, we'd be presenting an audit report. Everybody would have a PDF or even a hard copy of the report way back in the day. We'd all be on a conference call and we would identify who had control of the meeting. And the way it, very often happened is not George is in control of this meeting now. It'd be more of a handoff. I would introduce myself. We would introduce our team. The bank that we were presenting the audit for would introduce their team, and then I would say, okay, and so with that, I will turn control of this meeting over to Sean, who's going to present the audit report to you. And in the case of this particular webinar, I will turn control of this meeting over to Brian. Brian?
Thanks. Next, we're going to talk about features to consider and learn. And with that, I'm going to turn control of this webinar back to Dan.
I'm not going to go over every single one of these features if for no other reason, because there's more than 4 different applications that these features might apply to you with. But if I was you, I'd print screen them. Because when I say you can be in the power seat, it means that you're learning all of these features in your meeting platform. So if you're using Zoom, you got to learn how to do screen recording in Zoom. Believe it or not, it's really easy to train somebody if you record yourself doing it and then, with that person with you, but that person can then refer back to that recording. We can do that now with our new meeting platforms. And then I'd also think about these features. We use these at Infotext, but primarily because we do a lot of webinars, a lot of large meetings where there's 40 or 50 people and that sort of thing. Now, having said that, we had an employee event, a kind of one of our cultural events. They're not face-to-face events anymore. They're W2W, we call them, webcam to webcam. But a couple Fridays ago, we had virtual beer night as an example. And in that, what we did is not everybody drank beer. Some people drank wine, blah, blah, blah. But more importantly, we played games. Jackbox.tv, wonderful games to play. And we played together. It was good culturally for us. But more importantly, or more pertinent to what I'm talking about here, is we used the polling feature of our meeting platform so that people can vote on which games we're going to play. So that the poor guy who was moderating the meeting didn't have to, disappoint somebody who didn't get to play the game they wanted to play. So you can be in the new power seat by learning how to set up a meeting in Zoom or in Microsoft Teams or in WebEx. Infotext actually uses an application called Jive. That actually handles our virtual PBX, what I should say is our phone system. So we don't have a phone system like the bank does. We have Jive that will take all incoming phone numbers and forward them to the right people and that sort of thing. So that when we make calls from our own individual cell phones, it always comes from an Infotext number and that sort of thing. And so part of Jive is GoToMeeting and GoToWebinar. GoToWebinar is the platform that you're actually using right now if you're at our webinar. And then GoToMeeting is our meeting platform. And so the GoToMeeting platform has a hub where we can set up recurring meetings and that sort of thing. And so if you look at the left there, there's a weekly prospects meeting where we go over, the leads that we're working and that sort of thing. And it's always got the same URL, /DanHadaway/WPM. Now, with a lot of people, that meeting just automatically launches for them, and so they don't even have to remember the URL, but they do have to remember the password to get into the meeting. We also use what we call Meet Now a lot. A lot of times our calendar, we're in the where section of our calendar, or the location section of the calendar, it just say GTM Meet Now, which means that, hey, we'll just set up the GTM connection, right before the meeting. This is what, and you've probably seen this if you're at the webinar, a version of this, but this is the control panel for GoToMeeting. And, if you look here, you'll see that, you can see, what's being shared on the screen, and you'll see that says Meet Now, right? And so that's that Meet Now feature I was talking about. But that's important to look at because you want to do what we call screen sanitization. You always want to make sure if you're the presenter, you need to be aware of what you're putting up there. We don't want IP addresses, we don't want customer names or anything if this meeting includes people from outside of your bank, right? And so screen sanitization, if you're meeting with customers, is going to be like the clean desktop policy, right? And it's very important because customers will get upset if their information is shared, or if they worry that their information is going to be shared because they're seeing some other customer's information when they're in a Zoom meeting with you. Now, the other thing you want to know is how to manage the attendee list. That's that new power seat I was talking about, right? And so, how to invite people to the meeting, right? And you can actually send them an email message, or you can copy a link and Slack it to them, is what we do for all our internal meetings. We actually have an add-in now in Outlook to where when you set up a calendar appointment, you can click a button and it automatically sets up a GoToMeeting and gives you the credentials and the link for people to click on and that sort of thing, everything that you're seeing there. So back to managing the attendee list and being in that power seat, so to speak. But if you look here in the meeting with Brian Bunnell, if I right-clicked on his name, there's a number of things I could do to Brian or with Brian or whatever you want to call it, including sending him a personal chat message, making him the presenter. And GoToMeeting, if you're the organizer, that means that you can manipulate attendees. And so we usually go into a meeting and then just escalate everybody to organizer if it's a small meeting here at Infotext. To be a presenter, that means that you're allowed to share your screen. But it's really important that you learn this type of stuff for your platform, and then no matter where you're going, if you're a Zoom user but you have to go to a GoToMeeting for Infotext like you are if you're at the webinar, you probably have already run into this where there's always going to be the problem of the audio. Is my audio working? And so I always show up to my meetings a little bit earlier, even if it's in the platform I use day in, day out, 10 times a day, because I can never trust that the audio is going to work right off the bat. A lot of times I'll say to heck with it. I'm not going to try to fight with my computer. I'll just call in. And so I toggle it a phone call, and that makes it a lot easier. I don't have to get the audio to work, right? I can just call in. But back to the whole meeting inviting and that sort of thing, and really the whole use of recurring meetings is what you really want to know is that what's great about the recurring meetings is that people can memorize the URL of them and you don't have to do all the back and forth involved with setting up a virtual meeting. A lot of systems now will just automatically have the meeting launch for you. And then you go in muted with your webcam off and your screen not shared, so you're still safe. But, there's been times when I've returned from, a real conference, meeting with the people in my office here to sit down to a go-to meeting that's already started because it automatically launched and everybody else is in there wondering where the heck I am, especially since I'm always hounding that we need to start our meetings on time. So one of the things you need to realize, though, is that in order for recurring meetings to be safe, we need to put a password on them. And I know you're probably groaning and rolling your eyes and, oh, there's the IT guy, there's the security guy. I knew it was coming. Now we got to put a password on our meetings. This is outrageous. Ah! I get it. But what you need to realize is that with your meeting platform, you actually have two-factor authentication if you use that password, meaning that what you have is the time of the meeting, the place, the URL. That's what you have. And then what you know is the password, and therefore, just like your debit card, the password doesn't need to be one of those strong passwords that you hate us ISOs for, right? That you don't hate us information security. You love us information security officers. But you would rather we not require you use passwords, and now I'm saying, well, hey, you do have to use a password, but just so you know, the password into the meeting that we used to talk about this webinar, I remember it. It was MM, right? Meeting management. And the reason we can use such a small password like that is because it's the second factor of authentication. It totally eliminates the likelihood of somebody Zoom bombing us, which is what the password is supposed to protect us from. Well, what a great subject to segue into the issue of safety on, huh? And so why don't we go ahead and go there? So, how do we make sure that we're safe? And what I want you to know is that there is several movies out there about remote security by Infotex, and really there's probably hundreds of movies by other organizations. And the reason why is because in the pandemic, it's even worse. Okay, there's more people out there. I mean, look at this. It almost looks like a coronavirus graph, right? But that's the number of spear phishing attacks. And that's how the number has gone up since the pandemic hit. Here's another graph. And this is just email scams in general. And what you need to realize is this is actually phishing based on everybody using Zoom. There's a fish out there that's just focused in on Zoom. But that has always been problems that we've been dealing with, right? And what I want to make sure you know, because Zoom kind of did a bad job when the pandemic first struck because people found some vulnerabilities in their application and they seemed to act like they really didn't care. Well, then people like me started making fun of them and they basically came around and started caring a lot more. And so now we've got it down to just two issues, Zoom bombing, which you can fix with a password. And so if you're wondering, well, what is Zoom bombing anyway? That's when somebody shows up to your meeting that's not invited. It's just that simple. So you put a password on your recurring meeting, you don't have to worry about Zoom bombing anymore. But just to kind of drill down, I know I promised this wouldn't be too geeky and we're kind of getting into weeds here, but you want to make sure that your information security officer, if that person's still worried about Zoom, this graph that comes out of our due diligence process on vendors will show. We did a review of Zoom SOC 2, and Zoom's actually doing a lot better than even GoToMeeting, which is the platform we went with back in 2011 because it was the most secure platform. It's the only one that had an audit report. A SAS 70 is what it was back then. So your information security people, your IT people, they're going to go ahead and take care of the security, the cyber security controls. You don't have to worry about that. I mean, you probably might have to read the remote access policy and the access procedure and that sort of thing, right? Maybe there's a working from home procedure that you have to read. But actually setting up all the controls and stuff to make sure that those procedures are enforceable and everything, that's being handled by the IT department, right? Where we need your help is in being aware of the working from home procedure, being aware of how to sanitize your screen, recognizing that if you give somebody keyboard and mouse controls, that isn't the time to get up and walk away from your computer, okay? even the nicest people might take that as an excuse to send somebody an email message that's coming from you. But, you know, if you're letting a vendor have access to your computer and you're going to get up and walk away, I hope that would be something you would do at the office, right? There's a lot of things that you need to be responsible for. Using passwords in those recurring meetings. If the URL is the same, if you're going to do a meet now or every time, you don't need a password at all. And just so you know, I will admit that the meeting we had about this webinar, we're going to be talking about publicly classified information. So I agree that it's not like somebody was going to steal anything important if they Zoom bombed us, right? But, and by the way, teach Zoom a lesson, now their whole attack vector is named after them, right? Because they didn't have a good security system in place when the pandemic first hit. But what I want to make sure you realize is that we still use the as the password because that's our policy. And so whether or not, I don't want to make it a really hard policy to follow. And so the policy is if it's a recurring meeting, you use a password. If it's a meet now or a one-time meeting, you don't have to use a password. And that's our policy. Whatever policy your information security officer comes up with is surely going to be good for your organization. I just hope you realize that a 2-character password is no big deal. Now, there's still a lot of legal risk issues that are left not only from, the way we meet. It's really more just from around working from home completely. And so, we have a working from home procedure boilerplate that Sophia's probably, if you're at the webinar, you can download it as well. If you're watching the movie, just email us at infotext@infotext.com, or I'm sorry. If you're watching the movie, just email us at info@infotext.com and we'll get you the working from home procedure that addresses a lot of the legal risk. Suffice it to say that working from home does represent a lot of productivity risk. And there's a whole movie about productivity risk. It's not really that long, actually. It's only 10 minutes on movies.infotext.com. But it's really going to be up to you as a management team member to realize that this is when those key performance indicators, this is when those performance evaluations, this is when those efforts we've made to focus in on what the results should be from each job description are going to kick in. Because when people are working from home, it's about the results, not the time. We have to realize that when we're working from home, there's going to be more distractions. When we're working from home, we're going to blend our personal to-dos in with our professional to-dos. When we're working from home, we're going to be working from 8 to 10 at night sometimes, and maybe not from 8 to 10 in the morning others, right? And so it's really something you want to get your arms around if you're a management team member. When it comes to the cost of meetings, what we found is that the back and forth is really where you could allow meeting management to get out of control. And the way we solve that is with the formalized communication system. So, those recurring meetings that you'll read about if you download that formal communication system document. Those recurring meetings are how we save having to set up a meeting, because it takes more time to set up a meeting when you're doing it remotely. Now, we've heard a lot of our clients say, what I don't like about the remote meetings is that we always end up wasting all kinds of time talking about low priority stuff, and then the meeting's over and we haven't gotten to the high priority stuff. And when I hear that, what do you think I'm thinking? Yeah, you guys aren't using agendas, are you? And I did hear back, well, the problem with the agendas is that not everybody gets to weigh in on what we're going to talk about. Well, that's why we have the around the room in our agendas. And well, then I hear back, well, yeah, but we always run out of time to go around the room. Well, that's because you're not using agenda types in your agendas, or you're not allowing enough time, or somebody's not properly moderating the meeting. Well, there's way too many distractions when we're working from home. Well, we can't fix that. That's just the inherent nature of working from home. And so what we've done at Infotext is we've decided, hey, we're just going to recognize sometimes you're not listening. Please declare when you're not listening so that we aren't assuming you are. And then let's read them decision summaries before we let everybody, click on the X saying I'm ending my meeting. And then, just so you know, we should start the next meeting with the decision summary or the minutes or the action item summary, or whatever you're calling it. I don't know if you noticed, but those three terms are interchangeable in this talk. So at Infotex, we require each of our employees to declare at least 32 hours of availability time, and the additional 8 hours then can be used as flex time. And it gets kind of complicated. We actually have a GIF file on everybody's desktop that we can go to learn when certain members of our team work, because their schedules are a little bit weird. But most of us are, like me, I'm available from 8 to 4 on Monday through Friday. Now, I can work after those hours. I usually work before those hours. But I also do personal stuff between 8 and 4. But by golly, I'm available. If I go out on a golf course, my phone's on and it's with me. Ask the people I golf with, right? And then, because we are remote, we actually have a party calendar as a part of our, our formal communication system, right? And so we've identified proactively certain number of face-to-face meetings that, of course, have become web-to-web meetings now, webcam to webcam, like the virtual beer night I was telling you about. So I hope this talk was beneficial to you, and I definitely appreciate you, spending the time with us, learning about the new paradigm of meeting management. And I do know one thing: your information security officer, your IT person, your CIO, or whoever in your organization is definitely appreciates you spending the time with us today. And never forget, being aware of the controls, being aware of the risks, being aware of the threats, being aware of the vulnerabilities, being aware of where you could end up being embarrassed is 9/11 to the battle. Thank you very much. Michael, I'm returning the control of the webinar to you.
Great information as always. Thanks, Dan, and thank you for joining us today.